3 very horrifying. Spent a night with ghost horror stories. The car headlights sliced through the thick, suffocating darkness of the forest, illuminating nothing but endless trees that loomed like silent sentinels. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as the winding road seemed to close in around me. The lodge, my distant relative's mysterious inheritance, was just ahead. At first, the idea of owning a secluded historic property sounded almost romantic. But now, as I drove deeper into the shadowy woods, every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Finally, the lodge emerged from the gloom. It stood in a clearing, its silhouette stark against the inky black sky. My breath hitched. It looked wrong. Ancient wood warped by time, shutters hanging like crooked teeth, vines clawing their way up the stone walls. It exuded a kind of beauty, yes, but the kind that whispered danger. As I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air bit at my skin. The silence, it was deafening. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, oppressive silence that made your chest feel tight. I swallowed hard. It's just an old house. Nothing more. The porch groaned beneath my boots, each step louder than it should have been. The door, it didn't just open. It groaned, shuddering as though it resented my intrusion. Inside, the air was thick, stagnant, and damp. My flashlight revealed furniture draped in white sheets, the room frozen in eerie stillness. Dust hung in the air, catching the light like tiny ghosts. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, as though the house itself had secrets it wasn't ready to share. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back to me like a warning. On the walls, old family portraits stared back. Their painted eyes seemed to follow my every move, filled with something I couldn't name. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. It's just your imagination, I told myself, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. In the sitting room, something caught my attention, a leather-bound journal resting on the mantelpiece. It looked untouched, preserved like some forbidden artifact. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The pages were brittle, the handwriting meticulous, but unnervingly uneven. It was my great-grandfather's diary. Most entries were mundane, documenting daily life. But one line stopped me cold. "They come at night." I snapped the journal shut, my heart racing. The words echoed in my mind. Who were they? And why at night? I forced myself to push the thought aside and climbed the stairs to the bedroom. The room was sparse, just a massive bed, a single window overlooking the forest, and a mirror that seemed oddly out of place. I locked the door behind me. I wanted to believe I was safe, but as I lay under the heavy quilt, the house seemed to come alive. Every creak and groan felt deliberate, as though the lodge was shifting, breathing, watching. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me. I woke with a start. The darkness was suffocating, absolute. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt it, an oppressive weight in the air. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to listen. Then, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my door. Every muscle in my body froze. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps stopped. Right outside, the doorknob rattled. It wasn't forceful, it was slow, almost teasing, as if testing to see if it could turn. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then, silence. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I finally exhaled. The tension in my chest eased, but only slightly. It was just a nightmare, I whispered, trying to convince myself. But as I got up, something on the mirror caught my eye. A handprint. It was faint but unmistakable, small, almost childlike, and smudged as if it had been pressed there recently. I hadn't noticed it before. My knees buckled slightly, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I grabbed the journal and stuffed it into my bag. I wanted something to ground this experience, to remind me that it wasn't all in my head. But when I opened the journal again, my heart stopped. A new entry had appeared. It doesn't want you to leave. The slam of a door shook the house. My blood turned to ice. The wind? Number. The air outside was still. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to lunge at me. The air grew thick again, heavy and suffocating, as if something unseen was closing in. I ran. My hands fumbled with the front door lock, the key slipping from my fingers twice before it finally turned. I burst outside, gasping for air. But the forest, it was too quiet. Not a single rustle of leaves or chirp of insects. Just silence. I climbed into my car and started the engine, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the wheel. As I backed out of the driveway, something urged me, compelled me, to glance back at the house. And there, in the upstairs window, stood a figure, pale, motionless, watching me with hollow, unblinking eyes. My chest tightened. Panic surged through me as I tore my gaze away and floored the gas pedal. The car roared down the winding road, gravel kicking up in my wake. I never returned to the lodge. I couldn't sell it fast enough, but when the buyer mysteriously backed out before the deal was finalized, I knew why. To this day, I can't stop thinking about that figure in the window. Who or what was it? And why did it let me leave? But one thing is certain, I'll never go back, and I pray I won't have to. This is most disturbing. Spent a night with ghost horror story number 2. The small town of Rainsford always had its secrets. Whispers of curses, haunted woods, and shadows that moved on their own. But none of those compared to the legend of the Elmsworth house. It sat at the very edge of town, cloaked in fog and silence, like it was waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. Everyone knew the stories. The Elmsworths were wealthy, powerful. But their youngest daughter, Eleanor, vanished on her 18th birthday. Some said she ran away. Others, they claimed something far darker happened. When my best friend Mia dared me to spend the night there, I laughed. Nervously, I might add. "Come on," she said, grinning like the devil himself. "What's the worst that could happen?" The truth? I didn't want to find out. But here I was, standing at the rusted gate on a freezing October night. The air felt wrong. Too still, like the whole world was holding its breath. I pushed the gate and the screech of the hinges echoed into the night. My stomach twisted. The mansion loomed ahead, its cracked windows and ivy-covered walls almost alive in the moonlight. The front door creaked open like it was waiting for me. Inside, it was cold. So cold, it felt like the house had never known warmth. Dust covered everything, but there were footprints in the dirt leading toward the staircase. Footprints that didn't belong to me. I tried to shake it off. "It's just an old house," I whispered to myself. My voice sounded hollow in the silence. I set up in what looked like a parlor, a large room with an ancient, out-of-tune piano and furniture that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The wallpaper was faded, and the air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic. At first, I just sat there scrolling through my phone, pretending I wasn't terrified, but then I heard it. Humming. It was faint, just barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the house. The sound grew louder as I crept toward the staircase. My feet felt like lead. Every step groaned beneath me, announcing my presence like a scream. The humming led me to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, the darkness inside, absolute. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, but curiosity has a way of silencing fear. Inside the room, moonlight spilled through broken curtains, revealing a rocking chair that swayed gently back and forth. No wind, no reason for it to move. On the chair sat a music box, tarnished with age. I didn't want to touch it, but my hand moved on its own, lifting the lid. The melody of Greensleeves filled the air, haunting and beautiful, but wrong. It was slower than it should have been, dragging like a funeral march. And then, "Why are you here?" The voice was right behind me. My breath hitched. My chest tightened. I turned slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. No one. Nothing. Just the empty room and shadows that seemed to shift on their own. I backed out of the room, the music box still playing its ghostly tune. The hallway stretched before me, longer than I remembered. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, growing darker, reaching for me. I ran. Back in the parlor, I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. But when I turned around, she was there, a girl. No, a ghost. She stood by the piano, her figure faint and glowing. Her hair was long, dark, framing a face that was equal parts beautiful and tragic. Her dress was tattered, swaying like it was caught in a breeze only she could feel. her eyes, empty, hollow, piercing, locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. I couldn't speak. My throat felt dry, my body frozen. "My family," she said, her voice trembling with sorrow and anger. "They locked me away. They called me mad. They forgot me. And now—" Her figure flickered like a candle about to go out. "I'm trapped here." The room seemed to pulse with her pain. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I tried to apologize, my voice barely a whisper, but she shook her head. "You woke me." Her voice grew louder, harsher. "You should never have come." The walls began to groan. The piano played a single jarring note on its own. The room seemed to spin as her voice filled the air. "Leave." Now I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and bolted, her voice chasing me down the hall. "Don't look back," she screamed. I didn't. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the icy night air burning my lungs. But even then, as I reached the gate, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder, cold as death. I spun around, but no one was there. The house stood silent and still, but from somewhere deep inside I could hear it. The faint hum of green sleeves, haunting and relentless. I left Rainsford the next day and never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I still hear her voice, her sorrow. And I know she's still waiting for someone foolish enough to return. This is The Creepy, Spent a Night with Ghost Horror Story number 3. The inn at Willow's Edge had always been a place of whispered warnings and uneasy glances. It sat alone on a desolate hill, surrounded by a tangled forest that seemed to trap the twilight in its branches. For years the place had been abandoned, its sagging roof and shattered windows left to the mercy of the elements. Locals spoke of curses, ghosts, and the strange, unrelenting pull that lured people in, and never let them go. And now, I was here. I'm Fionara, and I've always been drawn to the strange and unexplainable. Ghosts, urban legends, eerie mysteries. They've always felt like a challenge. So when I overheard the inn being discussed in hushed tones at the local cafe, I knew I had to see it for myself. "You're seriously going?" my best friend Lara asked when I told her my plan. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Fionara, don't mess with this. People disappear there." "It's just an old building," I said, laughing it off, though her words planted a seed of unease. "I'll stay one night and come back with stories to tell. What could possibly happen?" Lara's expression didn't change. "You don't understand, it's not just a story. People who've gone in there, they've never been the same." Her words followed me as I drove out to Willow's Edge. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser until it felt like the trees were closing in. By the time the inn came into view, the last light of day was bleeding out, leaving the sky bruised and ominous. The building loomed ahead, taller than I'd expected. Its once grand facade was weathered and broken, ivy crawling up its sides like skeletal fingers. As I stepped out of the car, the air seemed to grow colder, sharper. My flashlight beam wavered as I pushed open the heavy door, which groaned like a living thing. The sound echoed through the empty halls, making me freeze mid-step. I forced myself to move forward, my shoes crunching on debris that littered the floor. The lobby was immense, its grandeur long since faded. A chandelier hung precariously, its crystals dull and cobwebbed. A massive staircase twisted into the shadows above, and broken furniture lay scattered like forgotten relics. Something about the silence felt wrong, too heavy. I chose a room on the second floor, one that still had a working door and a bed frame that hadn't completely collapsed. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floral patterns distorted and warped by years of damp. I set up my lantern on a rickety nightstand and sat down to write in my notebook, trying to distract myself from the oppressive atmosphere. The first hour passed uneventfully. I noted the strange stillness, the way the air felt thick, as though it was pressing down on me. But then, as the moonlight began creeping through the broken window, I heard it. A soft, deliberate creak, like footsteps on the floorboards above me. My pen froze mid-sentence, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. "It's just the house settling," I whispered, trying to convince myself. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Another creak, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The sound of my own voice startled me. It seemed to disappear into the air, swallowed by the stillness. Clutching my flashlight, I stepped into the hallway. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but shadows and dust. The sound of my breathing seemed unbearably loud, each exhale trembling with uncertainty. Then I heard it. A faint knock, slow, deliberate. It came from a room at the end of the hall. I hesitated, my pulse hammering in my ears, but curiosity, or maybe sheer stubbornness, propelled me forward. I stopped outside the door, which was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was empty, but the temperature was icy and the air felt heavy. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness before the beam steadied. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. For a moment there was silence. Then, clear as day, a voice, soft, mournful, and filled with despair. "Leave." My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I turned and fled back to my room, slamming the door shut and locking it, though I wasn't sure what good that would do. I sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. It was all in my head. It had to be. But then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, sharper. Dozens of voices speaking words I couldn't understand filled the room. Then, cutting through the whispers, came a melody. It was haunting and sorrowful, like an old gramophone tune warped by time. The sound seemed to seep into my very bones. I couldn't stay. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the hallway. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The whispers stopped. Then, from above, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sobbing. I looked up. The attic. Something inside me screamed to leave, but another part of me, the part that had brought me here, drew me forward. My legs felt like lead as I climbed the narrow stairs. Each creak beneath my weight echoed like a warning. The attic was freezing, the kind of cold that made your breath hitch. My flashlight revealed old trunks, forgotten belongings, and thick layers of dust. But then, in the far corner, I saw her. She was hunched on the floor, her back to me. Her long hair hung in tangled waves, and her dress was faded and torn like it belonged to another time. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She froze. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, brimming with sorrow so deep it felt suffocating. "They won't let me go," she whispered, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard. "Who won't let you go?" She lifted a shaking hand, pointing to the attic window. Outside, through the filthy glass, I saw them, faint glowing lights, flickering like lanterns in the woods. They moved closer, swaying unnaturally, as if carried by unseen hands. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice cracking. Before I could react, she dissolved into nothing, her sorrowful form vanishing like smoke. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I ran, down the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the night. The lights followed me, glowing brighter, until I reached my car. My shaking hands fumbled with the keys, but I managed to start the engine and peel away, the inn shrinking in my rearview mirror. Even now, safe in my apartment, the memory haunts me. Her hollow eyes, her despairing words, and those lights, they're burned into my mind. The inn at Willow's Edge remains silent and abandoned, its secrets locked within. But some nights, when the wind howls and the shadows feel too close, I wonder if she's still there, waiting.